This video will lead you through Chapter 4 of the study guide.
Please take time, if you have not already, to print out the list of segments for Mark chapters 1 through 8. This will prepare us for assignment number 5, which will require us to form observations over varying spans of the text. That's what we mean by kinds of observations, especially the span or the amount of the text. We will want to focus on narrow areas, the immediate context, and also by discipline, make sure we're watching the broader context as well. We'll divide these spans of observations into 4 groups or categories. First of all, let's take the broad look, the book level literary context. We're defining a Category 1 observation in the following way. For an observation to qualify as what we're calling a Category 1, it means that it must bridge more than one segment. Now you may be saying, well, what do we mean by a segment? A segment is what we're mapping out here in this screen for Mark chapters 1 through 8. We've divided them into 9 segments. Each segment then subdivides into paragraphs. So therefore, for an observation to qualify as Category 1, if you think of it as having one foot in one segment, it must have another foot in another segment. That is to say, it must draw an observation and link together more than one segment. Those segments may be adjacent, so one might be in segment 1, another in segment 2, or they may be spread apart, segment 2 and segment 7, perhaps. Most of ours will be watching fairly closely adjacent segments, but they don't need to be. They just need to span more than one segment. So a Category 1 observation reaches outside one segment and bridges to another. Let's see what this looks like in terms of an example. The first 3 segments of Mark, then we can find their geographical continuity. We're watching the actions and the ministry of Jesus and where they take place. So within the portion, the group of paragraphs that we're calling segment 1, and that begins in Mark 1:1 and reaches to Mark 1 verse 13, we see John baptizing Jesus at the Jordan River. We see Jesus again by a body of water, the Sea of Galilee, when he's calling for fishermen. That's happening in the next segment within chapter 1, verses 14 to 45. And then when we come to the third segment, segment 3, Jesus is again alongside a body of water, the seashore, and he's the one doing the teaching. What kind of material is this? It's geographical observation. Geographical, and it's continuity. That is to say, the same feature of geography, water, is showing up in these various observations. It's not the same body of water. Sometimes it's a river, sometimes it's a lake, but Jesus is associated with bodies of water. Simple as that. Now this then, once again, we're watching the material of the observation is geographical. What's going on with the geography is there's some continuity. It's showing up. Water, that is to say, water is continuously showing up. So the geography has continuity. Where in the span of material does it show up? It shows up in 3 separate segments, and that's what makes it a Category 1 observation. Incidentally, part of a good observation, the precision is to specify exactly which verse this information shows up in. So please notice that at the end of the segment 1 observation, we specify chapter 1, verse 9, and the water observation in segment 2, we specify it's in chapter 1, verse 16. Jesus teaching, the water feature there shows up in chapter 2, verse 13. It is important not only to indicate where the segment is, but to nail down very precisely where the information that you're pointing to shows up in the text. That was Category 1. Now what about Category 2? Here we are narrowing down Notice we're calling this immediate context. We're specifying that it's housed within one segment. Multiple paragraphs, but housed within one segment. So we're looking at relationships between words, phrases, clauses, events, ideas, quite a range of options. It needs to link 2 or more paragraphs in a segment. So just as category 1 had to step outside one segment and reach another segment, category 2 has to step outside one paragraph to another paragraph. But those should be paragraphs that are housed within the segment. Again, referring to that handout showing segments and paragraphs. Here's an example of category 2. We're focusing on segment 2, in particular the 3rd paragraph. We find that Jesus addresses the unclean spirit, commands silence from him, specifically Mark 1:25. That was the 3rd paragraph. And now in the 5th paragraph, still within segment 2, we see that Jesus similarly prohibits demons from speaking. Specifically, that's happening in chapter 1, verse 34. The material that we're looking at is action. What's going on with the action? Continuity. The same sort of action is happening twice, namely Jesus commanding silence. And that's happening in 2 distinct paragraphs housed within the span of one segment. That's what makes it a category 2 observation. Now, category 3. Notice that category 2 had us bridging between 2 paragraphs. Category 3 is going to get narrower still. Here we are limited to a single paragraph. Our focus is getting narrower and narrower. Do you remember the activity of establishing a broad structure that is an outline of a single paragraph? If you need to, look in the study guide on page 53 to remember what we mean by a broad structure. That is a general outline mapping out the action or the flow of thought in a single paragraph. When we're working with category 3, we want to have our observation anchored in, informed by what we already saw in the broad structure. It assumes that we've already established a broad structure for the outline, for the paragraph. So let's take a look then at detailed analysis of category 3. Here we have then an outline for Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. That is one paragraph, namely it's paragraph number 3, that happens to be located in segment number 2. Don't get lost in the paragraph numbers and segment numbers, just notice that it is in fact one paragraph. Now, we have put in bold font particular words that are going to feed into the observation that will show up next. So you see in point 1b, Jesus' authority surprises the people. Point 2b, Jesus demonstrates authority over the unclean spirit. And then in 3a, people are amazed at Jesus' authority. These are all showing up in separate points, components of this one paragraph. So, informed by that broad structure, this observation arises after we have seen this, in this case, a continuity, a recurring feature. Actually, instead of continuity, progression is what we're calling this, which is a little more informative than just continuity. Continuity says basically the same things happening over and over. Progression means it's growing, it's moving somewhere. So in the first observation, chapter 122, Jesus' authority causes people to register amazement. The second instance of authority demonstrated over unclean spirits. And in verse 27, chapter 1, people are amazed at his authority, whether it's in his teaching, that was verse 22, or over unclean spirits, that was verses 25 and 26. So it looks like the two components of authority over in teaching and authority over unclean spirits then are blended together, aren't they? In the third instance, observed by the people. Once again, category 3, for a category 3 observation, we begin by mapping out the broad structure. That is, we are analyzing a paragraph, distilling it into a simple outline, and we look at the outline and say, what does that tell me? Observations that arise from it, whether it be a progression, whether it be continuity, whether it be a change. Is there a shift in the middle of the paragraph? So there's a discontinuity. Is there a cause and effect? Is there a problem and solution all happening within one paragraph? That would be what we're going to designate a category 3. These categories 1, 2, and 3, and now we're coming to 4, there's nothing magical about them. It's rather a discipline to make sure we are watching, we're on the lookout and observing for more than one kind of connection within Scripture. It's a way of heightening our skill of listening. Here then comes category number 4. We're calling this thematic analysis. Thematic analysis. Notice the span in the subheading in parentheses. We are still confining ourselves to one segment, but we're branching out beyond one paragraph to more than one paragraph. In that way, category 4 is like category 2, multiple paragraphs within a single segment. Notice in the third bullet that we're concentrating on either events or ideas. Those are the materials that will make up our observations. We're not concentrating on materials that would have to do with geography. We're not concentrating on materials that would be just a repeated word, but rather events or ideas, looking for themes. That's why we're calling category 4 thematic analysis. This can take a little getting used to. It's think of it as gaining a little elevation. We're not staring at the text at close range, but we're getting up a little bit higher and looking over the broader landscape, getting a sense of the main ideas that are at work in multiple paragraphs. Now, the fourth bullet encourages us to concentrate in thematic analysis, concentrate on events and ideas that really are integral to a given paragraph, or multiple paragraphs in this case, not just something tangential. So try and concentrate on events or ideas that seem to be very pivotal or core to the movement or the message of a given group of paragraphs. Keep on using observation terms. Let's look at an example. Notice the bottom bullet where we're going to wind up with this category 4 observation is continuity. Continuity having to do with compassionate acts. So the theme will be compassion. We're going to watch a sequence of events where Jesus responds with compassion. And so we're observing this theme of compassion with continuity moving through these paragraphs, 3rd, 4th, and 5th paragraphs within a single segment. Take a moment to see the examples of compassion in the first 3 bullets. Incidentally, after the 3rd bullet, notice the inset with the word summation. It's interesting to observe that in that 5th paragraph, when Mark talks about Jesus both healing many people and casting out many demons, notice how he adds that word all. When evening came, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed. Summation is a specialized sort of an observation. It's a clue that something is progressing and then reaching a very broad, expansive, a summative level. There had already been Jesus healing and helping people with become free from demon possession. That had already happened in the 3rd paragraph. We have healing in the 4th paragraph. Now when Mark comes back to these topics, he intensifies it by injecting this word all. be on the lookout for that. Summation can alert us to something reaching a higher level. It's a simple sort of observation that can be very, very significant, very informative. To wrap this up then, it's category 4. It's a theme analysis. The theme is compassion, and we see it recurring, so it's continuity of the theme of compassion. With this slide, we want to encourage 3 particular skills and emphases within the observations that we make. First, we want to vary the span of material where we're making an observation, the scope or the amount. We want to not just work within one paragraph or not exclusively deal with multiple segments, but look broadly and then look narrowly. So we want to have our eyes open for broad and narrow observations. When it comes to what sort of literary relationships we're calling attention to, we want to be on guard against falling into just doing the same ones over and over again. Take a look at pages 34 to 42 if you're wondering what is it we're referring to by literary relations. Again, we want to be watching for variety. Think of it like colors of a rainbow. If all you ever saw was purple, well, that would get a little bit monotonous. There's a lot of colors out there, and we want to be attentive. Literary relations to variety. There's more than enough to go around. Levels of observation. When we refer to levels of observation, we're not talking about how many paragraphs or segments reaching from far to the left to far to the right in the text or the story or the teaching itself. Rather, think of it as vertical levels. If you think of the most basic level of information as providing for us history, plain facts of what happened, and then think of the artistry or the objectives of the writer, in this case Mark, the gospel writer, as he has to select from among many accounts of Jesus' activities, and he's going to select particular ones that are going to convey the message that he feels inspired to transmit. That selection process then is his authorial selectivity, including some and excluding some others that we've never heard about. That we call the literary level. We might think of that as a little bit higher up. Historical level is plain facts, literary level a little higher up. So we want to keep in mind to be thinking about where is it that we find it looks like Mark is doing something here with the material, the historic facts that he's chosen to include. It's hard to know what he's chosen to exclude, right? Because that's silent to us. But we want to be think as if you're in the mind of Mark and what he's presenting. Keep in mind 3 main phases of interpretation: definitive, rational, and implicational. These are covered briefly in the study guide, and here's what we have in mind by those. When we are just trying to figure out what something means, we're operating on the level of interpreting to derive a definition. If, however, we're trying to see how a couple of things relate to each other, perhaps cause and effect, we could call that interpretation rational. What's the reason for one thing leading to the next? A third level of interpreting the text can be called implicational. In this case, we don't have the specific cause and the very definite effect. We may have a cause and there's no effect given, so we're invited to guess at where this may go. Where is this going to lead? Jesus does something that's very unusual, perhaps shocking. Maybe he says something that shakes people up. Where is this going to lead? An implicational interpretation just turns this over in our mind and begins to explore what could happen next. So definitive, rational, and implicational are 3 different facets just to enrich our sense of what can go on when we move from observing to interpreting. This is a bit of review, and that's the reason you see various page numbers on the screen in front of you. Observation is awareness, and there are different elements of the text that we want to be aware of. Genre. How's it written? Is it poetry? Is it narrative? Is it a letter? Is it history? We want to be aware of terms, particular words that are used by the biblical author. We want to be aware of how terms relate to each other as grammar. Literary relationships we want to be aware of. And then the general atmosphere. Again, take a moment to page back in the study guide if you'd like to review what's meant by these expressions. In this slide, let's take a look at an interpretive question that can be posed of a passage, a question that arises from the broad paragraph structure. Here's what we mean by a broad paragraph structure. Concentrate for a moment on Mark chapter 2, verses 18 to 22. To outline that passage, it can break into two very simple parts. A question is posed and an answer is given. The question is posed about fasting in verse 18, and then the remainder going through verse 22 consists of Jesus' answer. That's our broad paragraph structure. Very simple. Here is the question that arises from that, and it's an interpretive question. Why, and you see at the bottom there, why does Mark devote so much space to Jesus' response, in contrast to how brief is the question? There you have it. Notice that it grows out of looking at the outline itself, the broad structure. Let's consider the purpose of interpretive questions. Developing the skill of asking useful interpretive questions is one of the most valuable skills that we can cultivate as we approach Scripture. The reason for that, in bullet 1, it opens the way to further discovery. When we begin to look at something in the text and then ask, why is it this way? Or where is it going? Or what are the implications of this? It makes us more attentive to deeper observation, deeper discovery of core message rather than just superficial information. The second bullet reminds us that our main goal in these interpretive questions is not mainly research questions. Now, research is very valuable. It gives us background information, especially information of a historical sort. Supposing you're reading a passage where Jesus is interacting with the Pharisees and the scribes, well, it'd be very important to know what is it the Pharisees and the scribes believe, what is their understanding of one's relationship with God, what is their power in the community, how do they get to that position, these groups of leaders. That would be a research question. Interpretive questions are not mainly aimed at digging up research information. Occasionally, an interpretive question may motivate us to move into resources and dig up things, but that's not where it really starts. That's not really the main goal. Rather, we're trying to get a better insight into what's going on with the message of the text. What we draw on oftentimes will be our own knowledge of what's going on in the text right there. Maybe something we're aware of in historical background, even human experience. When we're formulating observations, here are some tips to help us generate interpretive questions that are truly rich and valuable. We want to avoid questions that only marginally are connected to observations that we've made. We want to connect our interpretive questions. They should grow out of observations that we've already noted. So here's a good one. Observation. Twice in Mark chapter 1, Jesus is seen ministering, quote unquote, with authority. Once when he's teaching, and once in exorcism, the act of exorcism. And there we have the specific verses where that observation of continuity or repetition is going on, repetition of authority. All right, There's the observation. Here's the question that grows out of the observation. Notice the close connection. Simply this: why does Mark bother to portray Jesus ministering with authority in 2 instances? Why this repetition? That is an interpretive question, grows out of the observation. Here is a not so good example of an interpretive question. We're dealing with the same observation, Mark 1, authority twice repeated with the verses articulated. Now someone might formulate the question, well, what about the scribes? Why didn't they minister with authority? Well, it's interesting to consider, but do you notice how that's disconnected from the observation? The observation is Jesus did minister with authority, and it's mentioned twice. To take this rabbit trail off and ask, what's wrong with the scribes? Interesting, but not grounded in the observation. So that's a spinoff. Here's another weak example. Still, we're originating it in the same observation, authority twice. Notice the question: why did Jesus teach with authority? Well, that might be actually a fruitful question. The problem with it right here is it's not keyed into the fact that authority is repeated twice. That was the observation. I said to you, I saw authority twice. It's repeated. Then my interpretive question should key into that observation. It's entirely possible as you hear that caution, you're thinking, my, this is really tight, it's really narrow. It's a discipline, and we want to begin learning the discipline carefully. There may be places later on when we can relax things, but work with us now at the early end. I want to ask that your interpretive questions would be closely anchored, they'd be rooted in an observation that you've made, a literary observation. It's not uncommon for students learning the skill of asking interpretive questions to come up with yes-no questions. There's a problem with that. They tend not to bear fruit. A yes-no sort of question will just be an open and shut case. Should Jesus have done this? Yes. Okay. It just doesn't lead us anywhere. So it's better than to ask why questions, or what is the significance of kinds of questions. Do you remember the skill of outlining the passage? We call it a broad paragraph structure, reducing the information in the paragraph to points and subpoints. All right, here we want to encourage the development of interpretive questions that arise from the outline that we've observed. The value of that is, keep in mind, as soon as we have distilled information into an outline, we are able to pack that into our mind. We're able to get the main ideas compressed into our mind and control that sense of being aware of it more fluently. We're operating at a higher level of grasping and keeping in mind the information of a paragraph. If from that level, then, we can generate some interpretive questions, there's a very good chance that those questions are going to help us zero in to the core message of the author, because that outline is going to inform us about the big idea that's carrying through that information. So, in short, wherever possible, it can be fruitful to generate interpretive questions that spring out of an outline, not just some little particular piece of the close-up view of a text.
As an example of interpretive question based on broad paragraph structure, here again is one that we saw in Mark chapter 2. It's the question about fasting, and showing how Jesus' answer is considerably longer than the question itself. This time the observation is expressed as cause-effect, namely a question caused or evoked an answer, with a lot of space given to the answer, disproportion. The question, interpretive question arising from this broad structure observation. Why is it that Mark devotes so much space to Jesus' response? I trust this video shed light on some of the points within this chapter of the study guide. You'll want to go back and read over the study guide to ingest these ideas more deeply.